The morning I found my veteran neighbor standing in the rain with one hand pressed against a broken fence post, I thought I was about to help him repair a fence. I had no idea I was about to become part of a story that would change both our lives forever. He was 72, a retired Army veteran named Daniel Carter, and for years he had lived alone in the small gray house beside mine. Most neighbors knew him as the quiet old man who rarely left his porch. I knew him as the man who always raised two fingers in a small wave whenever I drove past. But that morning, when I saw him struggling to keep the fence from collapsing, something inside me refused to let me keep walking. Before we continue, if you believe that one small act of kindness can give someone a second chance, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness for more stories about second chances, unexpected connections, and the people who remind us that kindness is never wasted. I had been having a difficult year myself. After losing my job at a local construction company, I was doing whatever work I could find to keep up with rent and bills. My savings were disappearing faster than I could admit, and some nights I sat alone in my apartment calculating how many weeks I could survive if nothing changed. Helping Daniel was not exactly convenient. I had a job interview that afternoon, and my old pickup truck was barely running. Still, when I saw him struggling beneath the cold rain, I grabbed my toolbox and crossed the yard. Daniel looked at me with surprise when I offered to help. He tried to protest, saying he could handle it, but his hands were trembling from the cold and the wooden post was heavier than it looked. I told him that nobody should have to handle everything alone. For a moment, he stared at me as if I had said something much more important than I intended. Then he quietly handed me a pair of work gloves. The fence had been damaged during a storm a few nights earlier. Several boards were split, two posts had rotted at the base, and one entire section leaned toward the street like it was exhausted from standing for too many years. Daniel knew exactly what needed to be done, but his body no longer moved the way his mind commanded it to. As we worked, I noticed an old military photograph hanging inside his garage. Daniel stood in uniform beside several young soldiers, all of them smiling beneath a bright sky. He looked impossibly young. I asked him about the picture, and he simply said that most of the men in it never made it home. That sentence stayed with me. We worked until the rain stopped. Daniel showed me how to brace the new posts properly, and I discovered that his hands, despite their age, still remembered every practical skill they had ever learned. He told me he had spent his life believing that a strong fence was not meant to keep people out. It was meant to protect what mattered inside. By sunset, the broken section looked almost new. Daniel stood several feet away, studying our work. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not the polite little smile I had seen from his porch, but a real smile that seemed to belong to the younger man in the photograph. He thanked me and invited me inside for coffee. His house was clean but strangely empty. There were no family photographs on the walls, no children's drawings on the refrigerator, no signs that anyone had visited recently. On the mantel sat a single framed photograph of a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes. I noticed Daniel looking at it several times. I asked who she was. He said her name was Emily. Then he went silent. I didn't push him. But after a few minutes, Daniel leaned back in his chair and told me the story he had apparently been carrying alone for decades. Emily had been his daughter. She had been 22 when Daniel returned from one of his deployments. He had expected to come home and rebuild his relationship with her, but the war had changed him. He had nightmares. He became withdrawn and angry. Emily tried to reach him, but Daniel kept pushing her away because he believed that protecting his family meant hiding his pain from them. One night, after a terrible argument, Emily left. Daniel told himself she would come back. She didn't. Years passed. Pride became regret, and regret became something so heavy that he stopped talking about it altogether. He searched for her through old contacts and letters. He sent messages to addresses that no longer existed. Eventually, he stopped knowing where she lived. Then Daniel looked directly at me and said something I never expected. "There's someone I want you to meet." I assumed he meant an old army friend or perhaps a neighbor. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a photograph of a little girl. Daniel's granddaughter. His voice became unsteady as he explained that, after years of searching, he had finally discovered where Emily lived. She was only a few hours away. She had a daughter named Lily, and Lily was now 9 years old. But Daniel had never met her. He had recently learned that Emily had been struggling financially after a divorce and was working 2 jobs to support her daughter. Daniel had written her a letter, but he was terrified of sending it. He was afraid she would reject him again. I looked at the repaired fence outside the window and suddenly understood why he had been trying so hard to fix it himself. The fence wasn't the thing he was really repairing. He was trying to repair a life. I told Daniel that if he had spent 72 years wishing he could say something, perhaps he shouldn't spend another day being afraid of the answer. He looked at me for a long time and finally asked if I would drive him to see Emily. I agreed. The next morning, Daniel wore his old army jacket. He stood in front of his mirror for nearly 20 minutes, changing his shirt twice before finally laughing at himself. I had never seen him nervous before. The man who had faced war was terrified of knocking on his daughter's door. When we arrived, Daniel almost turned around. Then a little girl opened the front door. She had dark hair and the same bright eyes as the woman in the photograph. Daniel froze. The little girl looked at him curiously and asked if he was someone she knew. He couldn't answer. Emily appeared behind her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Emily's face changed. She recognized him. Daniel began apologizing before she could say anything. He apologized for the years, the anger, the silence, and every birthday he had missed. His voice broke as he told her that he never stopped loving her, even when he didn't know how to show it. Emily cried. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. Daniel collapsed against her shoulder like a man who had finally put down something impossibly heavy. The little girl stood nearby, confused at first, until Emily whispered that this was her grandfather. Daniel looked at Lily as though someone had handed him a miracle. She asked if he knew how to build things. Daniel laughed through his tears and told her he could build fences. Lily smiled and said she wanted a little garden fence. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in Daniel's backyard while he and Lily carefully measured pieces of wood. Emily was there too. The house that had once seemed empty was suddenly filled with voices, footsteps, laughter, and the smell of fresh coffee. Daniel's life had not magically become perfect. Neither had mine. I was still searching for steady work, and Daniel still had difficult mornings when old memories returned. Emily and her father still had years of hurt to work through. But something had changed. They were no longer carrying that hurt alone. A few months later, Daniel helped me get a position with a contractor he knew from his army days. I never asked him to do it. He simply made a phone call and told the man on the other end that I was someone worth giving a chance. The job changed my life. But Daniel changed something deeper. He taught me that sometimes the person standing beside you isn't asking for a miracle. They just need someone willing to hold the other end of the fence while they find the strength to drive the next nail. One evening, I sat with Daniel on his porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Lily was laughing in the backyard, and Emily was carrying dishes inside. Daniel looked at the repaired fence and quietly told me that he used to think his greatest mistake was losing his daughter. Then he shook his head. He said his greatest mistake was believing that because he had waited too long, it was too late. It wasn't. And neither was it too late for me. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who may need a little hope today, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness. Your support helps these stories reach people who might be quietly waiting for their own second chance. And before you go, I want you to answer one question in the comments: Who is the person you wish you could reconnect with, forgive, or simply tell that you still care? Because sometimes a fence can be repaired in an afternoon. Sometimes a family can be rebuilt over years. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person willing to stop in the rain and say, "You don't have to do this alone." Daniel taught me that second chances don't always arrive with dramatic music or perfect timing. Sometimes they arrive carrying a toolbox, wearing an old jacket, and standing beside a broken fence. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness isn't really about fixing what is broken. It's about reminding someone that they are still worth fixing things for.